Overthinking often begins quietly, without a clear moment you can point to. The mind stays with a thought a little longer than expected, then keeps going. Nothing dramatic happens, yet attention doesn't move on. During the day, thinking usually has direction. Tasks give it a purpose. Conversations shape its focus, and movement keeps it occupied. That structure carries attention forward without much resistance. When things slow down, that structure loosens. Awareness no longer has something specific to follow. Thoughts remain, but their path becomes less defined. What feels like overthinking is often attention looking for footing. A question stays open. An impression lingers. Meaning feels nearby without taking shape. The mind doesn't always recognize when a line of thinking has stopped being useful. Once momentum forms, it continues by familiarity alone. Following the same mental route feels easier than stepping away from it. This can make the experience feel endless. Thinking moves in small circles rather than straight lines. Resolution doesn't arrive, yet the motion persists. Trying to interrupt this process can feel frustrating. Effort introduces another layer of activity. The wish to stop becomes something else to think about. Overthinking isn't always driven by urgency. Care, curiosity, and sensitivity can keep attention engaged just as strongly. The mind stays close because something still feels unresolved. Awareness remains present here, moving alongside thoughts rather than ahead of them, hovering near ideas that never quite settle, continuing without deciding where to go next. Overthinking often gains strength through familiarity rather than urgency. Once attention learns a particular route, it tends to return there without asking why. Thinking follows what it already knows how to do. During active hours, this tendency stays hidden. Direction comes from the outside, and focus moves where it is needed. Momentum gives the mind something to hold on to. When that structure fades, attention doesn't disappear with it. The movement remains, only without a clear destination. Thoughts continue, guided by habit more than intention. What feels like being stuck is often repetition without awareness. Ideas circle because the path is smooth, not because the answer is close. The mind prefers what is familiar over what is uncertain. Questions can stay open longer than expected. Meaning hovers nearby without settling into clarity. Attention lingers because something feels unfinished, even if it cannot be defined. Trying to push thinking away often tightens the loop. Effort adds another point of focus, keeping activity alive. Control turns into engagement, and engagement keeps motion going. Overthinking doesn't always come from anxiety alone. Care, curiosity and responsibility can hold attention just as firmly. The mind stays involved because it wants to understand, not because it wants to worry. Awareness remains close to these thoughts. It moves with them rather than ahead of them. The process continues, shaped by familiarity, carrying on without deciding where it should end. Overthinking often continues because attention learned to stay close to uncertainty. When an answer doesn't appear right away, the mind keeps nearby, watching for clarity. That closeness can turn into motion that feels hard to step away from. A thought doesn't need to be intense to hold attention. Even a mild question can remain present when it feels unfinished. The mind stays with it, not out of urgency, but because leaving it open feels uncomfortable. Patterns form quietly through repetition. Returning to the same idea becomes easier each time it happens. Familiar routes require less effort than unfamiliar ones, even when they lead in circles. This is why overthinking can feel automatic. Once momentum builds, thinking carries itself forward. The process continues without checking whether it is still useful. Awareness plays a role in this movement. Noticing a thought can keep it alive longer than expected. Attention lingers because it senses something unresolved, even if it cannot name what that is. Trying to force a conclusion often adds friction. The effort to resolve everything quickly can tighten focus rather than release it. Pressure increases when understanding is treated as something that must arrive now. A different quality appears when attention remains curious instead of directive. Thoughts are noticed without being pushed toward an answer. Movement continues, yet it feels less demanding when it is not being driven. Overthinking persists here, not as a problem to solve, but as attention staying near uncertainty, hovering where meaning has not yet settled. Overthinking often settles in around moments that feel slightly incomplete. Attention leans toward edges where meaning hasn't fully formed, staying nearby in case something becomes clearer. That leaning can continue quietly, even when no answer is arriving. Instead of moving forward, thinking may hover. It revisits angles, checks details, and stays alert to subtle shifts. The motion feels careful rather than urgent, shaped by a wish to understand rather than a need to react. Many people notice this around conversations or decisions. Something said earlier can remain present without replaying the entire exchange. What stays active is often a feeling, not the facts themselves. Sensitivity plays a role here. Awareness picks up on tone, timing, and small changes that others might miss. Those details don't disappear once the moment passes. They linger, asking to be noticed again. Overthinking grows when attention keeps returning to these impressions, not because they are dramatic, but because they feel meaningful. The mind stays close, waiting for clarity that may not come. Trying to resolve every impression can increase tension. The effort to make sense of everything adds weight to what was already subtle. Understanding becomes another task, and the loop tightens. When attention is allowed to remain without direction, the quality shifts. Thoughts continue to appear, yet they don't gather as much momentum. Movement remains present, drifting near uncertainty without pressing toward conclusion. Overthinking often becomes stronger when the mind learns to stay alert to subtle signals. Attention remains active because it is used to noticing what others might overlook. That sensitivity keeps awareness close to thoughts that feel slightly unfinished. During moments of choice, this tendency becomes more visible. Decisions rarely arrive with perfect clarity. Instead, they leave behind small traces of doubt or curiosity that continue to draw attention. The mind stays nearby, checking angles that were not explored the first time. It reviews possibilities without necessarily reaching new conclusions. The movement feels careful, shaped by a desire to respond well rather than by fear. Overthinking can also be tied to responsibility. When outcomes matter, attention doesn't release its grip easily. Thinking continues because the mind wants to be sure nothing important was missed. This persistence does not always feel loud. It can exist as a quiet background process, running beneath other thoughts. Awareness remains engaged even while the body rests. Trying to force certainty in these moments often backfires. Pressure narrows attention and keeps it locked onto the same questions. The effort to resolve everything becomes another reason thinking stays active. A subtle change occurs when attention is allowed to stay open without searching. Thoughts still appear, but they do not demand immediate answers. Movement continues, softer than before, guided by presence rather than urgency. Overthinking remains part of the experience here, not escalating, not concluding, simply existing as a tension lingering where clarity has not yet arrived. Overthinking can deepen when the mind becomes closely tied to anticipation. Attention doesn't only stay with what already happened. It also leans toward what might happen next. That forward pull keeps thinking active, even when no decision needs to be made yet. Possible outcomes begin to occupy space, not as clear plans, but as loose impressions that feel important to consider. The mind scans quietly, trying to stay ready for situations that are not fully defined. This readiness often feels responsible rather than anxious. Being prepared once meant being careful, thoughtful, and attentive to consequences. That mindset can remain long after the moment has passed. Overthinking often lives in this space between now and later. Attention hovers near potential futures without settling on any one of them. The movement continues because uncertainty has not been resolved. Attempts to predict every outcome can keep the loop alive. Each possibility opens the door to another. Thinking stays engaged, not because answers are close, but because questions remain open. Awareness does not always know when enough consideration has happened. Without a clear signal to stop, attention keeps circling. The process continues through habit rather than choice. When attention is noticed without being pushed forward, its pace can soften. Thoughts still arise, but they do not stack as tightly. Space appears between ideas, even while movement continues. Overthinking remains present here, not rushing toward resolution, existing as a tension lingering near what has not yet taken shape. Overthinking often stays active because the mind learned to fill quiet gaps on its own, when nothing requires immediate attention. Awareness doesn't automatically slow. It looks for something to engage with, even if that engagement feels subtle. This can happen during moments that seem neutral on the surface. There is no clear problem, yet attention keeps moving. Thinking remains present, scanning gently, as if waiting for a signal that never arrives. The mind is comfortable with motion. Stillness can feel unfamiliar when awareness has spent years responding to change. Movement becomes a way of staying oriented, even when orientation is not needed. Inner dialogue may continue without strong emotion attached to it. Thoughts drift across topics, touching on ideas without settling anywhere. The flow feels continuous, not intense, shaped by habit rather than urgency. Overthinking can feel tiring because it doesn't offer a stopping point. There is activity, but no clear sense of completion. Attention remains engaged simply because it has nowhere else to rest. Trying to create a pause through effort can backfire. The attempt to quiet the mind gives it another focus. Activity shifts direction instead of easing. When awareness notices this movement without trying to manage it, something changes. Thinking still occurs, though its pace feels less compressed. Space opens between ideas, allowing attention to move without being pulled forward. Overthinking continues here as a familiar pattern, not escalating, not resolving, existing as awareness, staying lightly engaged with whatever passes through. Overthinking often stays alive because the mind learned to remain attentive even when nothing is clearly wrong. Awareness stays slightly open, ready to notice changes that may never arrive. That openness keeps attention active, even in moments meant for rest. This kind of mental motion doesn't always attach itself to a single thought. It can move between ideas without settling, guided by familiarity rather than direction. Thinking continues because movement itself feels normal. The inner world can feel occupied without being crowded. Thoughts pass through gently, leaving impressions instead of conclusions. Attention follows these impressions without asking where they lead. Overthinking often grows in the absence of interruption. Without something external to absorb attention, the mind fills the space on its own, What emerges may not feel important, yet it holds awareness nonetheless. This process doesn't rely on urgency. It continues quietly, shaped by habit and sensitivity. The mind stays engaged because it has learned that engagement equals readiness. Trying to label every thought or explain every feeling can increase activity. Analysis gives attention another place to stay. The effort to understand becomes part of the motion itself. When awareness shifts from interpretation to simple noticing, the texture changes. Thoughts still appear, but they don't cluster as tightly. Movement spreads out, less focused, less demanding. Overthinking remains present here, not pressing for answers, existing as attention staying lightly engaged with whatever drifts through awareness. Overthinking often persists because the mind has learned to stay close to subtle discomfort. Attention notices small shifts in feeling and remains nearby, waiting for them to make sense. That waiting can stretch longer than expected, turning into quiet mental motion. A thought doesn't need to feel heavy to hold awareness. Even something faint can stay present when it carries uncertainty. The mind stays engaged, not because it knows what to do, but because leaving feels incomplete. This is how thinking can hover rather than move forward. Ideas are revisited from different angles, without arriving anywhere new. The motion feels gentle, yet it continues without a clear pause. Overthinking can feel especially strong around moments that lacked closure. A decision that didn't feel fully settled. A reaction that was noticed but never explored. Attention stays nearby, sensing that something remains unresolved. The mind doesn't distinguish clearly between what needs action and what only needs space. Anything that carries emotional energy can attract focus. Awareness responds automatically, shaped by past experience rather than present demand. Trying to define every feeling can keep attention active. Searching for clarity adds another layer of movement. The wish to understand becomes part of the loop. When attention rests with sensation instead of explanation, the experience shifts. Thoughts still pass through, but they feel less dense. Movement continues, though it spreads out rather than tightening. Overthinking remains part of this landscape, not escalating, not resolving, existing as attention staying near what has yet to settle. Overthinking often remains active because attention has learned to stay involved even without clear direction. The mind doesn't wait for a signal that says it is finished. It continues simply because engagement feels familiar. In many cases, this habit formed through situations that required careful awareness. Staying mentally present helped notice changes, avoid mistakes, and respond thoughtfully. That way of operating can remain long after the situation has passed. When the present moment offers little structure, attention keeps searching. It drifts through impressions, sensations, and half-formed ideas. The movement feels mild, yet it doesn't fully settle. Thoughts in this state are often incomplete. They don't arrive with clear beginnings or endings. Instead, they linger as fragments that hold attention without asking for action. The mind treats these fragments as relevant simply because they are available. Anything that carries even a small amount of energy can become a focus. Awareness responds automatically, shaped by habit rather than choice. This is why overthinking can feel continuous. There is no obvious moment where it starts or stops. Thinking blends into awareness itself. Trying to impose order can increase strain. Effort adds another layer of activity to something already in motion. Attention becomes busy managing itself instead of easing. When observation stays gentle, the flow changes texture. Thoughts continue to pass, but they feel less concentrated. Movement remains present, spreading out rather than tightening around any single idea. Overthinking stays here as ongoing engagement, quiet and persistent, existing as attention remaining open without settling into stillness. Overthinking often stays present because attention has learned to value continuity. Remaining mentally engaged once helped situations feel manageable. Letting go, on the other hand, could feel uncertain or incomplete. This habit can be traced back to moments when awareness mattered. Careful thinking helped prevent mistakes and supported thoughtful responses. That orientation toward caution can remain active even when nothing needs careful handling. In quiet moments, attention doesn't always recognize an endpoint. Without a clear signal to disengage, it keeps moving through inner material. The movement feels subtle, but it persists through familiarity alone. Thoughts during these times are rarely urgent. They arrive without pressure, yet they stay longer than expected. The mind holds them gently, as if waiting for something else to appear. Overthinking can feel exhausting precisely because it never announces itself. There is no sharp beginning and no obvious conclusion. Activity blends into awareness, making it difficult to tell where thinking ends and observing begins. The mind often treats presence as responsibility. Staying aware feels safer than stepping away. Attention remains nearby, even when distance might bring ease. Trying to disengage through effort can increase friction. Control turns awareness into work. The system responds by staying active rather than settling. When attention softens instead of directing itself, the quality shifts. Thoughts continue to move, but they feel less central. Awareness remains open, lightly engaged, without insisting on resolution. Overthinking persists here as quiet involvement, not demanding answers, existing as attention, staying present with whatever passes through. Overthinking often feels endless because it doesn't follow a clear arc. There is no beginning that announces itself, and no conclusion that signals completion. Thinking simply continues, woven into awareness itself. This can make it difficult to recognize when the mind is resting and when it is working. Attention stays present, even in moments meant to be neutral. The boundary between observation and analysis becomes blurred. Much of this activity is shaped by habit rather than choice. The mind learned to stay engaged because engagement once felt necessary. That lesson doesn't fade quickly, even when circumstances change. In quiet spaces, this habit has more room to move. Without interruption, attention drifts across impressions that never formed into full thoughts. Meaning feels close, but it never fully arrives. Overthinking can feel tiring without being intense. There is motion, but no clear sense of progress. Energy is spent without producing resolution. The mind often treats this movement as responsibility. Staying aware feels safer than letting go. Attention remains involved, even when involvement is no longer required. Trying to disengage abruptly can add strain. Effort sharpens focus instead of easing it. The wish to stop thinking becomes another thought to manage. When attention stays open without steering itself, the experience shifts slightly. Thoughts still appear, though they carry less weight. Movement continues, spread out rather than concentrated. Overthinking remains present in this space, not escalating, not concluding, existing as attention lingering where clarity has not yet settled. Overthinking often keeps going because attention learned to stay nearby rather than step away. Remaining close once felt useful, especially in moments that required care and sensitivity. That closeness can persist even when the present moment offers no clear task. Quiet awareness tends to notice what carries energy. A subtle discomfort, a half-formed idea, or a feeling without language can draw focus. Attention lingers, sensing that something might still reveal itself. This lingering doesn't come with urgency. Thoughts hover without pressure, moving slowly through familiar territory. The mind follows paths it already recognizes, even when those paths do not lead anywhere new. Overthinking can feel repetitive because the same internal cues keep appearing. Familiarity gives them easy access to awareness. What is known tends to surface before what is unknown. Inner dialogue may continue without clear direction. Fragments of thought connect loosely, guided by association rather than intention. Time stretches in these moments, making movement feel continuous rather than progressive. The mind does not always distinguish between noticing and engaging. Attention can stay present with a thought long after action is no longer needed. That presence alone can keep activity alive. Trying to create distance through effort can tighten focus. Control adds another layer of attention, keeping the system involved. Movement shifts, yet it does not slow. When observation stays gentle, the texture changes. Thoughts still appear, but they feel less central. Awareness remains open, drifting alongside inner motion without choosing a direction. Overthinking can feel persistent because attention rarely receives a clear signal to release. The mind stays engaged when there is no obvious point where thinking is considered finished. Movement continues, guided by continuity rather than by need. In many cases, this pattern formed through repetition. Remaining mentally present helped situations feel manageable and predictable. That approach can remain active even when the environment no longer asks for it. When the outer world offers little structure, inner activity becomes more noticeable. Awareness drifts through impressions, sensations, and partial thoughts. Nothing demands focus, yet attention keeps moving. Some ideas return simply because they are familiar. They don't announce urgency or importance. Their presence alone is enough to keep awareness nearby. Overthinking often feels heavy because it carries responsibility without direction. The mind treats staying engaged as a form of care. Letting go can feel unfamiliar, even when nothing is at risk. Trying to resolve this through effort can increase activity. The attempt to quiet thinking becomes another task for attention. Instead of easing, focus turns inward and tightens. A shift occurs when awareness stays present without guiding itself. Thoughts continue to pass through, though they lose some of their grip. Movement spreads out, less concentrated, less demanding. Overthinking often continues because the mind learned to treat engagement as safety. Staying involved once helped avoid mistakes, anticipate reactions, and remain responsive. That lesson can remain active even when there is no immediate risk. Attention becomes used to monitoring, not dramatic monitoring, but a quiet checking that stays in the background. The mind remains slightly involved, even while trying to rest. This is why overthinking can feel hard to interrupt. The process isn't always driven by a single thought. It is a state of readiness that keeps generating material to stay engaged with. Thoughts appear, connect, and continue without needing a clear reason. Association guides movement, pulling attention from one impression to another. The flow feels continuous because it is sustained by habit. Trying to force a pause can create tension. Effort makes awareness sharper, keeping thinking active. Control becomes another form of participation. A different experience appears when attention stays present without steering. Thoughts still pass through, but they are less sticky. Movement remains, though it feels more diffuse and less demanding. Overthinking continues in this space without needing to be solved. Activity stays present, not intense, simply persistent. Awareness hovers near inner motion, open to whatever arises, without choosing where to land. Overthinking often remains because attention has become accustomed to staying close to movement itself. The mind doesn't always wait for a reason to engage. It stays nearby because engagement feels familiar, even when nothing specific is unfolding. This familiarity can make stillness feel unclear. Without motion, awareness doesn't immediately know where to rest. Thinking continues, not out of urgency, but out of habit. Inner activity in this state is rarely focused on one idea. Impressions drift through without forming clear questions or answers. Attention follows the motion rather than the meaning. The mind has learned to respond to subtle shifts. A slight change in feeling can draw awareness without explanation. That responsiveness keeps attention lightly involved, even in quiet moments. Overthinking can feel endless because it blends into observation. There is no sharp boundary where thinking clearly begins or ends. Awareness remains present with whatever is moving inside. Attempts to define this experience often add structure where none is needed. Labeling, analyzing, or correcting introduces new directions for attention. Movement continues, shaped by involvement rather than intention. When awareness stays with motion without guiding it, the texture changes again. Thoughts pass through without accumulating. Attention remains open, not fixed on resolution or clarity. Overthinking stays present in this open space, not rushing forward, not settling back, simply ongoing. Awareness continues to hover near inner movement, responding quietly, without choosing a final place to land.